Storm Point Lighthouse stood tall and solitary on a small, wind-swept island miles away from the mainland. It was an old, weather-beaten structure that had guided countless ships safely through the treacherous waters for over a century. The only inhabitant of the island was the lighthouse keeper, Jacob Reynolds, a man in his late 40s who had grown accustomed to the solitude that came with his job. Jacob had taken the position after the death of his wife, seeking refuge from the bustling world that reminded him too much of his loss. The lighthouse, with its rhythmic light and the constant crash of waves against the cliffs, provided a sense of peace that he desperately needed. The isolation didn't bother him. In fact, he welcomed it. Days at the lighthouse were simple. Jacob would perform routine maintenance on the old machinery, ensure the light was functioning, and occasionally take his small boat to the mainland for supplies. The rest of his time was spent reading, writing in his journal, or walking around the island, which was little more than a rocky outcrop with a few patches of stubborn grass and shrubs. There was nothing remarkable about the island, but it was Jacob's world, and he had made peace with it. However, as the weeks turned into months, something began to change. It was subtle at first, a flicker in the corner of his eye, a shadow that seemed out of place. Jacob dismissed these as tricks of the mind, a product of his solitude, but the occurrences became more frequent and harder to ignore. One night, as Jacob sat in his small quarters, reading by the light of a kerosene lamp, he heard a noise. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there, a soft, scraping sound, like something dragging across the stone floor. He put down his book and listened, holding his breath. The sound stopped. Jacob shook his head and smiled to himself. "Just the wind," he muttered, picking up his book again. But the unease lingered, making it difficult for him to focus on the words in front of him. Eventually, he gave up and went to bed, though sleep didn't come easily. The following night, Jacob stood on the balcony of the lighthouse, looking out over the dark expanse of the ocean. The sky was clear, and the stars twinkled brightly, reflecting off the calm waters below. The light from the lighthouse swept across the horizon, its beam cutting through the night like a sword. As he gazed out, Jacob noticed something strange, a light in the distance, flickering on and off. At first, he thought it might be a ship's lantern, but it didn't move like a ship would. It stayed in one place, blinking in an irregular pattern. Jacob frowned and grabbed the binoculars from the small table beside him. He focused on the light, but it remained distant and blurry, impossible to make out clearly. After a few minutes, the light disappeared altogether, leaving Jacob staring into the darkness. Confused, he made a note of the time and the direction of the light in his logbook. "Could be a shipwreck," he mused aloud, though something about it didn't sit right with him. The next day, he sent a message to the Coast Guard, reporting the strange light. The response he received was dismissive. They had no reports of missing ships or distress signals in the area. "Probably just some fishermen," they said. "Nothing to worry about." Jacob wanted to believe them, but the nagging feeling that something was wrong wouldn't leave him. The nights grew longer and colder as autumn set in. The wind howled around the lighthouse, and the waves crashed against the rocks with increasing fury. Jacob found himself spending more time indoors, away from the biting chill. But the strange occurrences continued. The unexplained noises in the night, the flickering lights in the distance, they became a part of his nightly routine. He grew used to them, though they never stopped unsettling him. One night, as he was preparing to climb the stairs to the lantern room, Jacob saw something that made his blood run cold. At the base of the stairs, in the faint light of his lantern, a shadow moved. It wasn't his own. He was standing still, and the shadow moved independently, as if it had a life of its own. For a moment, Jacob froze, his heart pounding in his chest. The shadow slid across the floor and disappeared into the darkness. He stood there, trembling, trying to make sense of what he had just seen. "It's just your mind playing tricks on you," he whispered to himself, though the words did little to calm his nerves. He quickly ascended the stairs and locked himself in the lantern room, where he stayed until the first light of dawn crept over the horizon. Days passed, and Jacob's unease grew. The shadow he had seen haunted him, appearing in his thoughts when he least expected it. He found himself glancing over his shoulder constantly, the feeling of being watched never far from his mind. He tried to distract himself with his duties, but even the routine tasks couldn't shake the sense of dread that had settled over him. The strange light in the distance continued to appear sporadically, and the noises in the night grew louder, more insistent. One evening, as Jacob sat by the fireplace, trying to warm himself after a particularly cold day, he heard a knock on the door. He frowned, puzzled. The island was uninhabited, and the only visitors he ever received were the supply boat crew, who weren't due for another week. The knock came again, louder this time. Jacob stood up slowly, his heart racing. He approached the door cautiously and hesitated before opening it. When he finally did, there was no one there. The night was dark, with no moon to light the way, and the wind howled through the cracks in the door. Jacob stepped outside, peering into the shadows, but saw nothing. He called out, his voice trembling slightly, but there was no response. As he turned to go back inside, he noticed something on the ground near the door. A wet, muddy footprint. It was large, far too large to be his own, and it pointed directly at the door as if someone, or something, had been standing there, watching him. Jacob slammed the door shut and bolted it, his hands shaking. He backed away, his eyes darting around the room, searching for any sign of an intruder. But there was nothing, just the crackling of the fire and the relentless wind outside. The following days were a blur of fear and confusion. Jacob's mind began to play tricks on him, or so he thought. He saw things, shadows moving in the corners of his vision, faces in the windows, and figures standing in the distance, just out of reach. The noises at night grew more persistent, scratching at the walls, footsteps echoing down the hall, and whispers that seemed to come from the very walls themselves. Jacob could no longer sleep, his mind too consumed by the terror that gripped him. He tried to reach out for help, sending messages to the mainland, but the responses were always the same. "It's just stress," they said. "You've been alone too long." But Jacob knew better. Something was on the island with him, something that watched him, tormented him. He could feel its presence, cold and malevolent, always just out of sight. One night, unable to take the fear any longer, Jacob armed himself with a lantern and a heavy wrench and began searching the lighthouse from top to bottom. He checked every room, every nook and cranny, but found nothing. But as he descended the stairs to the basement, the air grew colder, and the shadows seemed to close in around him. The basement was rarely used, a damp, dark place where old tools and supplies were stored. As he reached the bottom step, his lantern flickered, casting eerie shadows on the walls. Jacob's breath caught in his throat as he saw something in the corner of the room, a figure tall and thin, standing perfectly still. It was shrouded in darkness, its features obscured, but Jacob could feel its eyes on him, boring into his very soul. He stumbled back, dropping the lantern, which shattered on the floor, plunging the basement into darkness. In the pitch black, he heard it, breathing, slow and deliberate, coming from where the figure had stood. Jacob turned and fled, his heart pounding in his chest, his mind racing with terror. He locked himself in his quarters, barricading the door with whatever he could find. He sat in the corner, clutching the wrench, and waited for the dawn, though it felt like it would never come. The morning brought little relief. Jacob was exhausted, his mind frayed and his body weak. He knew he couldn't stay on the island any longer. Whatever was tormenting him wouldn't stop until it had driven him mad or worse. He made the decision to leave, to abandon the lighthouse and the island to whatever malevolent force had claimed it. But as he prepared to depart, he realized something that chilled him to the bone. The boat was gone. Panic set in as he searched the island, hoping against hope that the boat had simply drifted a short distance. But it was nowhere to be found. Jacob was trapped. The days that followed were a nightmare. Jacob's grip on reality slipped further with each passing hour. As days blurred into nights, Jacob's descent into madness accelerated. The oppressive sense of dread grew unbearable, gnawing at his sanity like a relentless predator. The shadows that had once danced at the edge of his vision now seemed to close in on him, becoming more tangible with every passing hour. He could no longer distinguish between what was real and what was a figment of his imagination. The strange lights continued to appear offshore, flickering and winking as if mocking him. No matter how hard he tried, he couldn't decode their erratic patterns. They seemed to communicate something, but the message was beyond his comprehension, lost in the tangled web of his unraveling mind. Jacob began to lose track of time. Days passed without sleep, without rest. He would sit by the window, staring out at the horizon, waiting for the lights to appear again, hoping against hope that they would stop. But they never did. His journal, once filled with meticulous records of his daily routines and observations, now held only ramblings, disjointed thoughts, desperate pleas for help, and drawings of the shadowy figures that haunted his every waking moment. He could no longer bring himself to perform his duties. The lighthouse had become a prison, its once comforting walls now closing in on him. The sounds at night grew more disturbing, no longer just whispers and footsteps. They became the anguished cries of unseen beings. The walls seemed to pulse with life, as if the very structure of the lighthouse was infused with malevolent intent. Jacob would cover his ears, rocking back and forth, trying to drown out the cacophony, but the sounds penetrated deep into his mind, leaving him no refuge from the terror. One stormy night, as the wind howled and the rain lashed against the windows, Jacob heard a new sound, one that was both familiar and terrifying. It was the sound of a boat scraping against the rocks at the base of the island. His heart leaped with a mixture of hope and fear. Could it be a rescue party? Had someone finally come to save him from this nightmare? Grabbing his lantern, Jacob rushed outside, braving the elements as he made his way down the slippery path to the shore. The rain stung his face, and the wind threatened to knock him off his feet, but he pressed on, driven by desperation. When he reached the shore, he saw a small boat, half submerged in the churning waters. A figure stood beside it, hunched over and drenched by the rain. The figure was tall, with its back turned to Jacob, obscured by a heavy, hooded cloak. "Hello," Jacob called out, his voice trembling with both fear and anticipation. The figure didn't respond, didn't even move. It simply stood there, facing the ocean, as if it hadn't heard him. Jacob approached cautiously, his lantern casting eerie shadows on the wet rocks. The closer he got, the more his fear grew. There was something deeply wrong about the figure, something that made his skin crawl. As he reached out to touch the figure's shoulder, it slowly turned to face him. Jacob recoiled in horror. The figure's face was shrouded in darkness, but its eyes were empty, black voids that seemed to suck in all light. They were devoid of life, of humanity, and yet they bore into Jacob's soul, filling him with a terror unlike anything he had ever felt. The figure raised a hand, pointing toward the lighthouse. Jacob didn't need words to understand the command. He turned and fled, running back to the lighthouse as fast as his legs could carry him, the wind whipping at his back, urging him onward. When he reached the lighthouse, he slammed the door shut and bolted it, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He didn't dare look out the window, didn't want to see if the figure had followed him. Instead, he sank to the floor, his mind racing, trying to comprehend what had just happened. Jacob knew he couldn't stay on the island any longer. The figure on the shore had confirmed his worst fears. Something evil had claimed this place, and it was only a matter of time before it claimed him as well. But with his boat gone, his options were limited. The storm raged on, making any attempt to swim to the mainland a death sentence. He was trapped, alone and vulnerable. Desperation drove him to search the lighthouse for anything that could help him escape. He rummaged through old storage crates in the basement, overturned every piece of furniture, but found nothing of use. The island was as barren as it was isolated. In a final act of desperation, Jacob decided to send out a distress signal. He climbed to the lantern room, where the powerful light still swept across the dark waters. He manipulated the light, sending out an SOS signal, hoping against hope that someone would see it and come to his aid. Hours passed, but there was no response. The light continued to sweep across the ocean, its rhythmic pattern the only thing standing between Jacob and complete despair. As dawn approached, the storm began to subside, and Jacob, exhausted and broken, slumped to the floor of the lantern room. He had done everything he could, but it wasn't enough. The realization that he was truly alone, that no one was coming to save him, crushed him like a tidal wave. Jacob awoke to silence. The storm had passed, leaving the island shrouded in an eerie calm. He had no sense of how long he had been asleep, but the light of dawn filtered through the windows, casting long shadows across the room. But something was wrong, terribly wrong. The light in the lantern room had stopped moving. It was frozen, its beam fixed on a single point out at sea. Jacob stood up, his body aching from the cold and the stress of the previous night. He peered out of the window, following the beam of light to its target. What he saw made his blood run cold. The light was fixed on a massive black ship, anchored just off the coast of the island. The ship was ancient, its sails tattered and torn, its hull encrusted with barnacles and seaweed. It looked like something out of a nightmare, a ghost ship that had no business being in the world of the living. And then Jacob saw them, the figures on the ship, dozens of them standing silently on the deck, their hollow eyes staring straight at him. They were the same as the figure he had seen on the shore, their faces obscured by shadows, their bodies shrouded in darkness. Panic surged through Jacob as he realized what was happening. The ship had come for him. The shadows, the noises, the lights, they had all been leading to this moment. He turned and ran down the stairs, his heart pounding in his chest. He had to escape, had to get off the island before it was too late. But as he reached the ground floor, he froze in his tracks. The figure from the shore was standing in the doorway, blocking his only exit. Its eyes were locked onto his, empty and pitiless. It raised a hand, pointing once again toward the lighthouse. Jacob's mind snapped. He couldn't take it anymore. The fear, the isolation, the madness. It was too much. He let out a scream of pure terror and fled back into the lighthouse, the figure's presence chasing him like a dark cloud. He didn't know where he was going, only that he had to get away. He ran through the narrow halls, past the rooms where he had once found solace, up the winding stairs to the lantern room. When he reached the top, he slammed the door behind him and locked it, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He was trapped, but at least he was alone, or so he thought. As he turned around, he saw them, the figures from the ship, standing silently in the lantern room. They had surrounded him, their hollow eyes watching him with an intensity that bordered on hunger. Jacob backed away, his mind screaming for escape, but there was nowhere to go. The figures closed in, their presence suffocating, draining the life from him. He pressed himself against the glass of the lantern, his eyes wild with terror. "Please," he whispered, though he didn't know who he was pleading to. "Please don't." But there was no mercy in their eyes, No pity, no compassion. The figures reached out for him, their cold hands closing around his arms, his shoulders, his throat. And then, with a final, blood-curdling scream, Jacob was pulled into the darkness. When the supply boat arrived a week later, the crew found the lighthouse abandoned. The door was wide open, the lantern room empty, and there was no sign of Jacob Reynolds. The island was eerily silent, as if it held its breath, waiting for something to happen. The crew searched the lighthouse from top to bottom, but found no trace of the lighthouse keeper. The only clue to Jacob's fate was his journal, left open on the desk in his quarters. The final entry was a scroll of incomprehensible words and frantic drawings, depicting shadowy figures and a ghostly ship. The crew, shaken by the discovery, reported the disappearance to the authorities. An investigation was launched, but no answers were found. Jacob Reynolds was declared missing, presumed dead, another victim of the unforgiving sea. But the island remained. The lighthouse continued to stand, its lights sweeping across the ocean, guiding ships to safety. And on stormy nights, when the wind howled and the waves crashed violently against the rocks, sailors would sometimes report seeing strange lights flickering on the distant horizon, casting an eerie glow across the water. Rumors began to circulate about the lighthouse and its last keeper. Some spoke of Jacob Reynolds as a ghost, doomed to wander the island for eternity. Others whispered about a malevolent force that had claimed him, a darkness that lurked beyond the fringes of the known world. Fishermen and sailors who had once avoided the island now spoke in hushed tones, warning others to stay away from Storm Point. The authorities, having found no concrete evidence or witnesses, eventually ceased their search. Life went on, but the legend of Storm Point Lighthouse grew, a tale of dread and mystery that haunted those who heard it. The lighthouse itself remained operational, tended to by a new keeper who had been assigned the task. This new keeper, eager and confident, dismissed the old tales as mere superstition. But as the days went by, they too began to experience the strange occurrences that had plagued Jacob. The new keeper reported seeing shadows moving in the corners of their vision, hearing the faint whispers in the night, and occasionally a shadowy figure that seemed to watch from the edge of their sight. The strange lights continued to appear offshore, their patterns erratic and unsettling. One particularly stormy night, the new keeper saw something that made their blood run cold. A black ship, ancient and ghostly, appeared on the horizon, its dark sails flapping wildly in the wind. The figure from Jacob's last night seemed to have returned, its empty eyes staring from the deck of the ship. The new keeper, like Jacob before them, felt the oppressive weight of fear and dread settle over them. The lighthouse became a place of nightmares, its once comforting presence now a symbol of terror and isolation. And so, the cycle continued. The island remained a place of foreboding, a dark spot on the map where shadows and whispers thrived. The legend of Storm Point Lighthouse lived on, its story told and retold in hushed tones. The lighthouse itself, standing solitary and unyielding, continued to cast its light across the ocean, a beacon for lost souls and a warning to those who dared to venture too close. As for Jacob Reynolds, his fate became a part of the island's lore, a cautionary tale of a man lost to the darkness that haunted Storm Point. The lighthouse keeper's presence was felt in the flicker of the light and the whisper of the wind, a reminder of the terror that lay hidden in the shadowed corners of the world. And so, the island remained silent and watchful, its secrets buried deep within the rocky shores and the endless, churning sea. The lighthouse stood as a sentinel, its light cutting through the darkness, forever casting its eerie glow over the forsaken island, a reminder of the thin veil that separates the known from the unknown, the living from the dead, and the light from the shadow.